calculate that my first talk on Welsh woodlands was done 54 years ago, and I'm beginning to feel every one of the subsequent years and feeling that nothing in between. We have many talks of substance later on during the day, and mine is really just kind of introduction and a context for Welsh woodlands, which I hope gives subsequent speakers some leads or points of departure for their particular contributions. On the screen at present, and apologies to those right at the back who forgot to bring their binoculars, is a picture of a view of oak woodland in the countryside behind Harlech. My impression, which probably formed in the 1960s and is still current as far as I'm concerned, is that for most people, if you raise the question Welsh woodlands or say Welsh woodlands, the image which comes to mind is one of wet oak woodlands clinging to a hillside somewhere in West Wales, probably in northwest Wales, typically like this. Certainly the Nature Conservancy, which I joined in 1967, thought like that, and in the early years of the Nature Conservancy there were a large number of very small and scattered oak woodlands representing every mortal variation there could be of this sort of oak woodland was drawn into the National Nature Reserve series. And I have this feeling still that this emphasis in thinking about Welsh woodlands still gravitates a bit to the north and the west. And since I come from west of Offa's Dyke, albeit from England, in other words from the southeast, I'd like to somehow correct this balance just a little bit. Now, next slide, if I may. One of the things I would just like to emphasise is that although I'll be talking principally about the semi-natural woods, I wouldn't like anyone to run away with the idea that the plantation forests are in any way trivial to this sort of discussion. This is a particular stand of Douglas fir, which grows just by the car park and picnic site at Ganflwyd as you come north out of Dolgellau. It's one of the most impressive stands of trees I know in Britain, actually. I don't know quite why it is, but it's one that's made one of the great impressions on me. And I think it's because when I first saw it with a small saloon car driving along a little lane beside it. And it made me think immediately of my experience in driving through the redwoods in Northern California, where all cars seem like toys and the trees are simply enormous. You have just a faint tinge of that impression here. Now, purely on spectacle, it seems to me that some of these stands are important, but I think biologically they also should not be disregarded. So, although I'll return to this only briefly later, I would like these not to be forgotten. Now, in talking about Welsh woodlands, as I said, I think the emphasis has been on north and west, and I think we'll need next slide, please. Now, this one, I'm afraid, really was devised for people with really very keen eyesight and not from too far away. So I might have to leave the stand and work this out. Does this come out or not?
Yeah, pull it out.
Right. What I wanted to say is that Welsh woodlands are far from uniform. We need to get some idea that there is a variety, quite a considerable variety within Welsh woodlands, which I've tried to summarise here and give it some context. Now, this rather scrappy little map comes from a publication where there's some extraneous detail, but for those who have got the eyes to see, there is a zone A here, which is basically in three large patches, which I call Western Uplands, which is a zone of the oceanic woods, which are the kind of characteristic wet, bryophyte-ridden woods which you find along the west coast. They extend right down to Galicia, and their prominence in Ireland on the west coast there. Now that takes up quite a lot of Wales, as you can see, the north and the west. But there's another zone, which I've labelled C, which you may not be able to pick out terribly easy from this, but these are what I have tended in recent years to call borderland woods. They're a very distinctive type. They're not lowland, they're not really upland, but they extend in a zone right the way through the boundary zone between the traditional uplands and the traditional lowlands of Britain. These woods are much more mixed, and they tend, and indeed down in the Wye Valley area, which is where I come from, they are some of the richest mixed woods in the whole of the British Isles. And anything we talk about in Welsh woodlands has to encompass this great range of types. We're not talking about any sort of one-size-fits-all approach to looking after our woodlands. Next one. This map, which I found very useful, coming from a Countryside Council for Wales publications, summarises the prominence of the oak woods in all woodland. Essentially, for those who won't be able to read the key, the dark area shows where oak woods represent over 80% of all the woodlands in those areas. In other words, you've got a kind of contour map of the prominence of oak. And you can see that my rather sketchy map of two zones, a northwest and a southeast zone for Welsh woodlands, makes some sense against the background of this map. But it also shows you that it's by far from being a kind of strict partition. The two kinds of woodland interdigitate throughout Wales. It's just that the emphasis shifts from northwest to southeast. Next slide. So let's have a look at representatives of these two types of woodland that we have in Wales. This is my representative for the wet, upland, bryophyte-rich, fern-rich, mossy, damp, often heathery, often grazed woodlands of the north and western hills. It's Coed Fluid. It's, I believe it's a National Trust property, but it's a National Nature Reserve. It is centred on this cataract, which is where I believe most of the bryophytes are, but the place is also valuable for some of these epiphytic lichens, which, and Ray Wood's sitting there in the front row, no doubt correct me or I get agitated, but most of these, I think, the best examples of these I've seen are actually outside the wood, in the trees beyond the actual National Nature Reserve. In other words, as far as I know, totally unprotected. Indeed, one of the big trees fell down a year or two ago, and I got a very close-up view of those areas. Much of the woodland, though, is actually quite uniform in structure. You can see on the lower left what I mean by that. The trees have grown in lollipop shape. They're all roughly the same age, but their diversity of structure has been increased in recent decade and a half by wind throw, particularly at the top edge of the wood. So there is some diversity being introduced into that. Now that's just what you see and what you have. Next slide will show you something about how it got to be like it is. And I think this is important. Now, this really was designed not for a long, thin audience, but a short, wide audience, I'm afraid. But so I'll try to talk your way through this. This is one of Mary Edwards' pollen profiles within this case, Coed Fluid, where she gets the history of the wood from the pollen trapped in and preserved in the peaty deposits. Now, I'll just try and explain this, and I hope this isn't too confusing. But from here, we've got about 1,200 years ago, and that's now. Straightforward time sequence. The whole diagram, this is 100%, as it were, pollen comes from there to there. This is herbs. This jagged, mindless saw edge is shrubs. And this area of the graph is trees. And what you can see from this immediately is that the proportion of herbs and shrubs and trees in that wood has changed enormously over the last 1,200 years. In fact, right now, it's got as much trees as it's had since deep into what in England would be Saxon times. If you look at the detail as well, in other words, the species, and remember this is an oak wood, and you follow the trace for oak, which is actually this run of dark filled spots, you can see that this varies enormously. And we come to the interesting conclusion that there is far more oak in that wood now than there has been basically in history. This is the most oak time it's ever been. And that's a very general finding for a lot of these oceanic oak woods. You can find it from South Cornwall right up to northwest Scotland. The same finding comes out again. These oak woods are more oak wood than they've ever been now. If you look too at the counterpart trace, which is birch, you can see that goes up and down a great deal, and more or less in a kind of seesaw with oak. We get classic oak-birch swing in composition. So the kind of message one wants to take away from this is that what you see and can easily perceive as a woodland of time immemorial, which has been there unchanged for heaven knows how long, has in fact gone through the mill. It's changed to and fro repeatedly over the last 1200 years, and we're dealing with a unique situation in its history right now. In fact, the simple explanation of this one is that I think in 1840 or thereabouts, most of the then woodland was felled and then planted with oak. What is described as a semi-natural oak woodland of the sessile oak type, representative of the natural woodland of Wales, is in fact a plantation. And one needs to remember this, that these woods have a history. And the other sample sites she looked at, Coed Ruggan, for example, Coed Cymerae, all showed this kind of general feature of major change in their history, even though each individual wood had different kinds of change. So if you looked at a whole lot of these, and it would take most of the afternoon if we did it, you would realize that each wood is an individual now and in its history. And it's as well to remember the individuality of woods. Next slide, please. Now we're switching to the southeastern half of Wales, or the eastern and southern half. And I've just put in here a fairly ordinary example of a woodland which one finds in Monmouth. In fact, it's the Springdale Farm Reserve of the Gwent Wildlife Trust. And it's a straightforward, outgrown, coppice with standards woodland with pedunculate oak over hazel, maple, and not shown in that slide, a fair amount of ash. Sort of thing you find throughout the English lowlands as well. But here, of course, there's far more ferns and mosses and things, being rather western. I mean, it wouldn't be quite like that if you were looking at such a wood in Essex. So here is something quite different. It hasn't been grazed through by sheep, and it's a good representative of the southeastern woodlands. Now, next slide, please. Some of these woods, I said, are astonishingly rich. The best slide I've got to show this is an autumn shot taken with a drone of the Wye Gorge in Lady Park Wood, which is where I do most of my woodlands work these days, which actually brings out simply by the colour pattern the diversity of woodland. You can find almost all trees except hornbeam and Scots pine in the woodland floor of Britain within these woods. That's also in Wales. Next one. And these two have been through a history of management. This is not Lady Park Wood, but it could equally be. It's Tintern Abbey. The woods on the far side are, I'm afraid to say, in England. But what they are is they've just been coppiced, and it's 1900. Look at the date from an old postcard. And the thing to remember here, and it surprises people who actually live in the Wye Valley now, where they live in an outstanding area of outstanding natural beauty, where the woods seem to be natural, very old, tottering around, unmanaged, to look 120 years ago to see that these woods were actually clear-cut. There would be an outcry now if that was done, but that's what happened in the past and is really the main feature of their history. Next slide, please. Now, I have tried to summarise the differences in histories of the two zones of Britain. Now, it's a question of differences of an emphasis, and given that most of you in the far behind will not have the power of eyesight to see the detail, I don't think I'll dwell on the detail, but I just wanted to emphasise one thing out of this, which is that between the original woodland, whatever form it took, and the traditionally managed woodlands of which we're familiar, must have been quite a substantial area of wood pasture, of open grazings, trees-covered land, mixture of big trees, spreading trees, shrubs, probably some cut and so some coppice, and all the time some pasturage within that. So that next slide, please. And this is not Wales, I'm sad to say, but it's a bit of Western Scotland. It's part of the Zone A. That kind of scene, I think, would have been reasonably familiar with anyone who, in the Middle Ages, roamed the Welsh countryside. If you read the Welsh history book by Bill Linnard, you will see that wood pasture is a major feature right through the Middle Ages and extended actually into the post-medieval times, even in the Wye Valley area. So instead of that uniform, dense oak woodland that you see on the hillside now, I think what you would have been familiar with as sort of 12th century farmer would have been woodlands more like this. Just a useful visual image to keep in the back of your mind. Now, next slide, please. So these woods have gone through a lot of changes. The recent changes have been one of neglect, both of the upland oak wood areas and of the lowland mixed deciduous areas. And I think these have had quite a substantial effect on our biodiversity. Now, this is a big subject. In fact, virtually every slide on this is a big subject which could go on and on. But the one place where I have got one definite personal knowledge of what has actually happened in biodiversity terms is in this Lady Park Wood, just in Wales, where in the time where I've been involved here, there's been a substantial decline in the ground flora. This is a wood left totally unmanaged, deliberately for research purposes. And you'll see here that before 1979, 164 vascular plant species had been recorded in the wood. And when we set out to find them recently, we could only find 112 within the wood. That is a massive loss of biodiversity. And it's more than that, actually. We have plots which are small, here are 8 meters square scale, about the size, no, a bit bigger than the table in front of you there, but still that kind of scale of plot. And we recorded a whole series of these, so a couple of hundred of these throughout the wood, and got a score for how many species there were occurring in a sample patch of woodland that size, and did it again 30 years later. And the drop in the numbers of species in something like that was 50%. An enormous thinning out. Likewise, at the 200 meter scale, which is a rather larger sample, it was only 27%. In other words, the difference indicates that these species are thinning out rather than actually disappearing. But nevertheless, this is a loss of biodiversity. And I think that's pretty general. I mean, the butterflies, which used to be virtually every species known in the southern half of Britain occurring in the Wye Gorge, almost none of them are found now. And that's another side of the same coin. So next slide summarizes the points I just want to make from this quick review of the sort of background to the woods we're dealing with. It seems to me that we have to be well aware that we're dealing with variety, not the kind of thing. Maybe I'm labouring a point unnecessarily, and it's a relic of my own history, but we do have to remember that there's a lot of variety, and the south and eastern woods are really rather different from north and western woods. That they have not been stable, they have changed a lot, though in your lifetime and mine, of course, they tended to look as if they're fairly stable. Their history is really one of management rather than neglect, and we should remember that, and it has had consequences in, I think, the loss of biodiversity. Obviously, there have been some gains. In the case of Lady Park Wood, it's rich in fungi, which may represent a gain. And the other thing I wanted to draw out from this, which is not really demonstrated by evidence, but by the hint from these lobaria coed gan fluid combined with the wood pasture history, is that trees outside woodland are as much a part of the history of woodlands as trees in woodland, and should be taken into account when considering woodlands in Wales and what you want to do about them. So, how are we doing for time? Just a few looking forward things. Now, I have a mild sense of futility about this, given that the gathering ecological and social crises we all face, but for what it's worth, here are a few thoughts about how we might look forward in all this. First of all, I'm sure we need far more woodland in Wales and anywhere else, simply for the carbon sequestration benefits of it, but also for many other reasons. And what we're going to be doing is building on an existing pattern. One advantage you have in Wales, it seems to me, is that even in places which are part of the southeast and not part of the northwest, where valleys impose the pattern, you get strong linear patterns in woodland, which is useful because it does mean that the woodlands tend to be linked up, fairly well linked up. In fact, one of the most linked substantial areas of woodland in the whole of Britain, the Lower Wye Valley, runs about 30 miles north to south, and the same thing east to west. Must be one of the most connected pieces of woodland in the whole of Britain. This is the pattern we build on. What I don't see there is really there's sharp divisions between woodland and non-woodland, which is something which I would like to see diffused a little. But we build on a pattern, and I think that would be, but the question is how. So next slide. Will be incomprehensible to most of you from the distance you are, but what it is, it's a turn of the 20th century Ordnance Survey map of part of Monmouthshire, which shows apart from anything else, the Woodland Trust Reserve. I don't know how much of that you own, but the real core area of woodland on that map is Wentwood, which is associated with the Woodland Trust these days. And at one time it was linked to the Wye Valley Woods, which start there. All this was woodland as well. But the question when we say more woodland and building on the existing pattern is always a question of how and where. Do we try to link Wentwood back to the Wye Valley Woods and connect it to a much larger group of woodlands? Do we try and reinforce the small scatter of woodlands up there, for example, by planting within them and making functionally one wood? Do we try and link that, shall we say, to the woodlands running along the scarp here, which then connects it better? I mean, there's a whole lot of choices to be made, and even if you know which one you want as an ecologist or as someone interested in the landscape, you've still got to convince the people who actually own the land what to do. What creating a habitat network does means that you're inevitably deflected into networking in the other sense. You have to work with a whole lot of people, and I think that's a good thing. Next slide, please. I hinted at the Brecon picture that I think there is a need to try and integrate the habitats a bit more rather than have sharp boundaries. I mean, East Anglia is very much cursed by having razor-sharp boundaries between habitats. You put 1 foot in an arable field and 1 foot in a woodland, and they're in very different worlds. And in Wales, it seems to me, you have opportunities to at least mitigate that kind of unfortunate state of affairs in biodiversity terms. This is an example, again, from behind Harlech, where you see a mixture of trees and woodlands and grassland and marsh on the edge of the hills. And you can see that the woodland, the tree element in this scene are actually fairly well linked. They're close together. The squirrel, notional squirrel, could leap if it wanted to from bush to bush without touching the ground. Equally, the grassland and the marshland species are not isolated from each other as well by blocks of woodland, sharp woodland. This integration of habitat and these mixtures of trees and herbaceous things are, as it were, the ideal if one can incorporate them into land use patterns. Admittedly, it's very difficult, but it's something which would be desirable. I've seen this sort of thing develop in 20 years at the Knepp Estate in Sussex, which is a rewilding experiment, now becoming quite famous. And it could be that if rewilding in Wales took the form of extensive cattle ranching and not a lot of tree planting, this is the kind of thing which would develop. But I just note here that I'm well aware that the idea of rewilding has not been totally sold to every person living in Wales. Next slide. I think it's important to try to increase the opportunities to utilise the native woodland timbers in Wales. I was very much in favour of the enterprise I always associate with David Jenkins' name, sadly now no longer, in which you've got your oak woods managed and you use the oak timber for things which actually were useful in Wales. My own experience of this is somewhat ambivalent. This is my oak for home, and those in fact are my shoes. When we went to try to get oak flooring from someone who had been supplied by Coed Cymru, I dealt him a blow by saying, well, actually, I'm rather a specialist in this thing, and I actually want to go to the wood from which you got the timber, so I can photograph the wood and use the timber and the photograph of the wood and its management all in one slide for my professional purposes. And there was a lot of humming and hawing. Anyway, the long and short of it was they didn't have traceability. And I went to Somerset to get that from someone who knew exactly where it had come from and was happy to show me around the wood, and I could photograph it. So, ambivalent pattern there. And I think finally, next slide. No, not quite finally, penultimately. Return to the conifers. I think, as I said, that one of the things which we should be aware of is that the conifer plantations will themselves become more and more diverse, and the broadleaves will come into it. This is another view of that same Douglas fir stand, just the ones I happen to have in digital form. And you can see there's quite a strong broadleaf element. That could be managed to either conifers or broadleaf from this point quite easily. But it does seem to me that we should not be dismissing the upland conifer plantations as sort of pure unmitigated conifers. They are becoming far more diverse. This is a good thing, and we can manage and control the proportion of broadleaves in them very easily indeed. And I think now, finally, I wanted something which I'm afraid will be rather difficult for people with less than absolutely perfect eyesight in the bottom half of the room. But one of the things which I've become far more interested in later years has been the fact that although I give talks like this and reach an audience which is essentially sympathetic, I hope it is, well, only reaches a very small minority of the people who I think increasingly we need to reach. Somehow we need to get environmental messages and sympathy for environmental points of view to a wider public. Of course, eventually this was what influences the political discourse. Now, my contribution to this is not unlike a lot of other people's, which is to try to merge woodland, my specialist knowledge of woodland, with the artistic appreciation of woodland. To that end, we invited a group of tree specialist artists into Lady Park Wood to sort of carry out an exercise in painting. I learnt what interested them. They learnt quite a lot of ecology. I learnt a fair amount about how to paint and look at woodlands from the aesthetic point of view. And they produced a whole series of paintings, of which these are a sample, which themselves, I mean, I could lecture for a whole morning just on this one slide and the implications of each one of these pictures. And I think this is important because it's getting woodland messages indirectly to quite a lot of people which we would never reach at all without some sort of broader association with the rest of people's interests. So I commend this sort of thing. If anyone's interested, these are some of the paintings on exhibit in the Nelson Museum in Monmouth right now and for the next few months, if you actually want to see it. But this has been an exciting challenge, and I think if anyone's ever been to the New Networks for Nature conferences and has done a lot of reading of the burgeoning nature writing book, then you'll find that there's a whole lot of people who are now interested in, as it were, spreading and merging the sort of cultural contacts between specialist ecology, research ecology, and, well, the rest of humanity's interests. I hope there's some leads in that. Thank you.